Texas Territory, 1882, a place where words could cut deeper than any knife, and a man's honor was measured by which battles he chose to fight. Some say there are lines you don't cross on the frontier. Boundaries set not by law, but by the unwritten codes of the West. Take your hands off that woman. 5 words. Spoken by a man who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. What happened next in that town square would be whispered about for generations, but never recorded in any history book. They tried to bury this story. They tried to forget the day when a black rancher stood alone against an entire town's prejudice and showed them all what true courage looks like. Stay until the end to discover how one man's refusal to stay silent changed the course of countless lives and revealed a truth about the West that few are brave enough to acknowledge. If this is your first time here, welcome to The Black Rancher, where we unearth the buried stories of courage that shaped America's frontier. These aren't the tales you learned in school. These are the truths that were deliberately erased. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell. Join our community that's committed to restoring the complete, unfiltered history of the American West. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply standing up for what's right. Now, let's ride back to Texas Territory, 1882, where our story begins. Isaiah Freeman had not spoken more than 10 words in the 3 days since he'd arrived in Redemption Creek. He hadn't needed to. Most folks took one look at his weathered face, powerful build, and the quiet confidence with which he moved and decided conversation wasn't necessary. At 42, Isaiah had spent most of his life letting his actions speak for him. Born into slavery in Tennessee, he had earned his freedom fighting for the Union, then worked his way west, building a reputation as one of the finest horse trainers in the territory. Now he owned a small but prosperous ranch 20 miles outside of town, where he raised quarter horses coveted by everyone from wealthy ranchers to the U.S. cavalry. The citizens of Redemption Creek hadn't quite figured out how to categorize Isaiah. He wasn't like the Buffalo soldiers stationed at nearby Fort Davis, who kept to themselves. He wasn't like the few other free black men in the county, who mostly worked as farmhands or laborers. Isaiah Freeman owned land, good land, and that made him something of an anomaly. He rode into town that Thursday morning with a simple list of supplies, grain, coffee, ammunition, and a few yards of fence wire. The kind of ordinary errand that shouldn't have been memorable, shouldn't have changed lives, shouldn't have exposed the raw nerves of a town balanced on the razor's edge between old prejudices and a new frontier. Isaiah tied his horse outside Hardwick's general store and nodded a silent greeting to Mr. Hardwick, who had learned to appreciate Isaiah's business, if not the man himself. While Hardwick gathered his supplies, Isaiah stood by the window, watching the dusty main street where a small crowd had gathered near the water trough. At the center of the gathering stood a Comanche woman. She was perhaps 30, with high cheekbones and keen dark eyes that reflected neither fear nor submission, despite being surrounded by jeering townsmen. Her simple dress was a blend of traditional Comanche design and settler practicality, a concession to living between two worlds. Around her neck hung a small leather pouch, decorated with intricate beadwork. "English woman, speak English or go back to your people," shouted a red-faced man in a stained buckskin jacket. "We don't need your kind in our town," the woman replied calmly in Comanche, her chin lifted with unmistakable dignity. "She says she has permission to trade here," translated a young boy standing at the edge of the crowd. The child, no more than 12, shifted uncomfortably as all eyes turned to him. "My pa worked with the Comanche scouts for the army. I picked up some words." "Well, tell her permission or not, we don't serve savages," said another man, stepping uncomfortably close to the woman, especially ones who won't show proper respect by speaking American. The woman took a step back, maintaining her composure. In perfect accented English, she finally spoke. "I come to trade fair. I have permissions from Indian Agent Wilson. My people make peace 3 winters ago." "Your people murdered my brother at Yellow Creek," snarled the man in buckskin, pushing forward. "Should have wiped out the whole tribe when they had the chance." Isaiah watched as the man reached out and grabbed the leather pouch around the woman's neck, yanking it hard enough that the cord cut into her skin. "What have you got here? Stolen goods?" Some kind of heathen charm. Something shifted in Isaiah's expression, a subtle hardening around the eyes, a tightening of the jaw. He placed his hat carefully on the counter and stepped outside, moving with deliberate calm toward the gathering. "Take your hands off that woman." His deep voice cut through the jeers and taunts, silencing the crowd as effectively as a gunshot. All eyes turned to face the tall black man, now standing at the edge of the circle, his stance relaxed but somehow unmistakably ready. The man in buckskin sneered, still gripping the leather pouch. "This ain't your business, Freeman." "Go back to your horses." "I'm making it my business," Isaiah replied, his voice level. "That's no way to treat a lady." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. "Lady? She's just a squaw." "A woman deserving respect," Isaiah countered, taking another step forward. "Let her be." The tension in the square thickened as the two men locked eyes, neither willing to back down, both aware that what happened next would ripple far beyond this moment. Sheriff Thomas Delaney was enjoying his third cup of coffee when he heard the commotion from the town square. At 58, Delaney had seen enough trouble to know when to intervene and when to let things sort themselves out. The shouting didn't immediately concern him until he heard someone yell Freeman's name. Isaiah Freeman was a complication in Redemption Creek. Delaney didn't particularly like the man, but he respected him. More importantly, he respected Freeman's right to exist peacefully as long as he followed the law, a view not universally shared in the territory. With a resigned sigh, Delaney set down his coffee, adjusted his gun belt, and stepped out of his office. Back in the square, the standoff continued. The man in buckskin, Jack Harmon, a small-time rancher with a big-time temper, still hadn't released the Comanche woman. "You're defending an Indian over your own kind," Harmon challenged Isaiah, voice rising. "Ain't about kinds," Isaiah replied. "It's about right and wrong. And you're wrong, Harmon." A dangerous smile spread across Harmon's face. "That's rich, coming from you. Tell me, Freeman, where do you get off thinking you can tell white men what to do in their own town?" Isaiah didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted to the Comanche woman, whose eyes held a strange mixture of surprise and wary assessment. Their eyes met briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between two people accustomed to navigating hostile spaces. "I'm not telling anyone what to do," Isaiah finally said. "I'm telling you what not to do. Let her go." Each word fell like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the crowd. Some of the onlookers began to shift uncomfortably, suddenly aware they were witnessing something that might escalate beyond the usual town square entertainment. "Or what?" Harmon challenged, giving the pouch another yank that made the woman wince despite her stoic expression. Isaiah took another deliberate step forward. "Or I'll make you." A murmur went through the crowd. Everyone knew Isaiah Freeman was no ordinary rancher. Rumors circulated about his time as a Union soldier, about confrontations with cattle rustlers that had ended decisively in Freeman's favor. He wasn't known as a violent man, but neither was he known as one to make empty threats. "That sounds like a threat against a white man," called someone from the back of the crowd. "That's hanging talk in these parts." Isaiah didn't flinch. "It's a promise to anyone who'd harm a woman in my presence. Don't much care what color either of you are." Sheriff Delaney pushed through the crowd just as Harmon's free hand moved toward his belt knife. "That's enough." Delaney's voice carried the full weight of his authority. "Harmon, let the woman go. Freeman, step back." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, Harmon released the leather pouch, shoving the woman slightly as he did so. "This isn't over," he muttered, loud enough for Isaiah to hear. The Comanche woman straightened her dress, her expression unreadable as she looked between the men. Her fingers moved to the pouch, touching it briefly, as if to ensure its contents remained safe. "Ma'am," Sheriff Delaney addressed her, "do you have permission from the agent to be here?" She nodded once, reaching into a small bag at her waist and producing a folded paper. "Trading permission. I am Morning Star. My father is Chief Black Elk of the Southern Band. We have peace treaty." Delaney examined the paper and nodded. "This seems in order. You're within your rights to trade here, but..." He glanced around at the still hostile faces. Might be best if you conduct your business and move along quickly. That how justice works here, Sheriff? Isaiah asked quietly. Woman gets harassed for existing and you tell her to hurry up and leave? Delaney's weathered face tightened. I'm trying to prevent trouble, Freeman. Suggest you do the same. Trouble already happened, Isaiah countered. Just nobody's answering for it. The crowd had begun to disperse, though several men lingered, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Harmon had retreated to the saloon across the street, where he stood on the porch with 3 companions, all staring at the scene with thinly veiled hostility. I need no help, Morningstar said suddenly, looking directly at Isaiah. Comanche woman, not afraid. Isaiah met her gaze. Never thought you were, but disrespect shouldn't go unchallenged. Something flickered in her expression, surprise perhaps, or reassessment. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture somewhere between acknowledgement and respect. I finished trading now, she said, turning toward the general store. I'll accompany you, Isaiah said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Need to pick up my supplies anyway. Sheriff Delaney watched them walk toward the store, aware that what had just happened was more significant than a simple confrontation. Lines had been crossed, alliances suggested, challenges issued. In a frontier town balanced on decades of racial tensions and fresh memories of Indian wars, such moments could spark consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. Lord help us, he muttered, turning back toward his office. This day just got a whole lot more complicated. Inside Hardwick's general store, an uncomfortable silence reigned. Mr. Hardwick glanced nervously between Isaiah and Morningstar as they conducted their separate business, clearly uneasy about serving them both, but unwilling to refuse either customer outright. Morningstar moved efficiently, exchanging beautifully tanned deerskins and intricately beaded moccasins for practical items, coffee, flour, metal needles, and a small mirror. Her movements were precise, economical, those of someone who knew exactly what she needed and was accustomed to completing her business without unnecessary interaction. Isaiah gathered his own supplies, maintaining a respectful distance, but positioning himself where he could see both the woman and the door. Occasionally their eyes would meet, brief moments of silent communication that acknowledged their unusual alliance without requiring words. When they finished their transactions, Isaiah gestured for Morningstar to exit first, then followed, carrying his supplies to his horse. To his surprise, she walked alongside him rather than immediately leaving town. You risk much, she said quietly as they reached his horse. For stranger, for enemy. Isaiah secured his packages before answering. Don't consider you an enemy. Others do. Others don't always get to decide. Morningstar studied him with unabashed directness, assessing him in a way few people ever had, without preconception, without the overlay of societal assumptions. She was seeing him, Isaiah realized, simply as he was. Why? She finally asked. Isaiah understood the question went deeper than his intervention in the square. She was asking about motivations, about the complex web of choices that had led a black rancher to publicly defend a Comanche woman in a white town. My mother taught me respect doesn't cost nothing, but disrespect costs everything, he said simply. Didn't matter if she was talking about white folks, colored folks, or anyone else. Said dignity isn't something that can be given or taken, it's recognized. Morningstar nodded slowly as if his words confirmed something she'd already intuited. Your mother was wise, woman. She was. Across the street, the saloon doors swung open as Jack Harmon and his companions emerged, their postures suggesting they'd fortified their courage with whiskey. They paused on the boardwalk, staring at Isaiah and Morningstar with undisguised hostility. Your horse is there? Isaiah asked, nodding toward the small pinto pony tethered at the far end of the street. Yes, I'll walk with you. Morningstar looked as if she might refuse, pride warring with pragmatism in her expression. I told you, not afraid. Never thought you were, Isaiah repeated, but sometimes courage is accepting help when it's offered right, not just facing danger alone. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by the barest hint of a smile, the first genuine emotion she'd displayed since their encounter began. You speak wisdom for a cowboy. "And you speak English better than you first let on," Isaiah observed, matching her subtle smile with one of his own. This earned him a slightly broader smile and a shrug. Sometimes useful what people think of you. Together they walked toward her horse, aware of the eyes tracking their movement, the whispers following in their wake. Halfway there, Morning Star spoke again, her voice low. "The pouch. It contains medicine. My daughter's medicine." Isaiah glanced at her, surprised by the voluntary information. "Your daughter sick?" Morning Star nodded. "Lung sickness. Medicine man makes special herbs. I come to trade for sugar to mix with it. Make her take it easier." The simple maternal concern in her voice created an unexpected connection between them, the universal language of a parent's worry transcending the barriers of race and culture that separated them. "Hope she recovers quick," Isaiah said. "She is strong," Morning Star replied with quiet confidence, "like her mother." They reached her pony, and Morning Star secured her traded goods with practiced efficiency. Before mounting, she turned to Isaiah. "My people camp at Broken Rock Creek, 3 days' journey from here." She hesitated, then added, "If you ever need shelter there, ask for Morning Star of Black Elk's band." The offer of hospitality, from a Comanche to an outsider, was significant, and Isaiah recognized it as the profound gesture of respect it was. "Thank you," he said simply. "Safe journey." Morning Star mounted her pony with fluid grace. "You also. Watch those men. They have snake hearts." With a final nod, she turned her pony and rode out of town, sitting tall in her saddle, her back straight and head held high, the very picture of the dignity Isaiah had defended. If you're still with me, you understand why stories like this matter. Here at the Black Rancher, we're committed to uncovering these hidden moments when courage crossed the boundaries society tried to enforce. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button now. Join our community that believes in learning the complete history of the American West, not just the sanitized version we've been told. And if this story resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful act is simply standing witness to another person's dignity. Now let's continue with our story and discover what happened when Isaiah Freeman returned to his ranch. The attack came just before dawn. Isaiah had been expecting trouble, but not so soon. He'd returned to his ranch the previous evening alert and watchful, checking his property boundaries before settling in for the night. He'd even kept his horse saddled in the corral, an old habit from more dangerous days. The sound that woke him wasn't loud, just the subtle crunch of a boot on gravel outside his cabin, but it was enough. Years of frontier living had attuned his senses to the difference between natural sounds and those made by men with bad intentions. Isaiah rolled silently from his bed, already fully dressed. He'd slept that way, anticipating this very possibility. His Remington rifle was within easy reach, loaded and ready. From the window, he could make out 4 silhouettes moving toward his cabin in the pre-dawn light. Their approach wasn't particularly stealthy. They moved with the confidence of men who believed their target would be sleeping, vulnerable. Isaiah considered his options. The cabin had only 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace and a smaller bedroom, 2 windows and 1 door. In a straight fight, the odds weren't good, but Isaiah Freeman hadn't survived 42 years by taking fair fights. Silently, he moved to the back window, eased it open, and slipped outside just as the first heavy knock came at his front door. "Freeman, get out here! We need to talk about your Indian-loving ways." Isaiah recognized Jack Harmon's voice, slightly slurred with alcohol and bravado. He circled around the cabin, keeping to the shadows, making his way toward the corral where his horse waited. "Maybe he's not here," one of the other men suggested, voice uncertain. "Saw his horse," another countered. "He's here all right." "Knock again," Harmon ordered. The pounding resumed, more insistent this time. Isaiah reached the corral, speaking softly to his horse to keep it calm as he untied the reins. "Enough of this," Harmon growled. "Break it down." The sound of splintering wood echoed across the small ranch as the men forced their way into the cabin. Isaiah mounted his horse, guiding it quietly away from the corral toward the ridge that overlooked his property. Shouts of confusion erupted from the cabin, as the men discovered it empty. They burst back outside, lanterns raised, searching frantically for their missing quarry. "There, on the ridge," one of them shouted, pointing toward Isaiah's silhouette against the lightening sky. Isaiah made no attempt to flee. Instead, he turned his horse to face them squarely, rifle resting casually across his saddle. "4 men to 1 cabin," he called down, his voice carrying clearly in the dawn air. "Seems like poor odds, for you." The men froze, suddenly aware of their vulnerable position, bunched together in the open yard, clearly visible, while Isaiah held the high ground with a clear line of sight. "We just came to talk, Freeman," Harmon shouted, though the broken door of the cabin gave lie to his words. "Most folks do their talking in daylight," Isaiah replied, "without breaking down doors." "You crossed a line yesterday," Harmon continued, trying to regain control of the situation. "Choosing an Indian over your own kind?" "There you go again with kinds," Isaiah said, his voice remaining steady. "Told you yesterday it's about right and wrong, and breaking into a man's home, that's wrong by any standard." The 4 men exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. They'd expected to find Isaiah sleeping, vulnerable. Instead, they found themselves exposed, outmaneuvered. "We're just delivering a message," Harmon insisted. "Stay away from town. Stay away from white folks' business. You're tolerated here because you keep to yourself. Start causing trouble, that tolerance ends." Isaiah shifted slightly in his saddle, just enough to remind the men of the rifle in his hands. "Seems to me you're the ones causing trouble. On my property, before sunrise." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Now, I'm going to give you one chance to leave, peaceful-like, or we can have a different kind of conversation." For a long moment, no one moved. Then one of the men, the youngest of the group, took a step backward. "Jack, let's go. This ain't worth dying over." "Listen to your friend," Isaiah advised. "Smart man." Harmon's face contorted with fury and humiliation. "This isn't over, Freeman." "It is for today," Isaiah countered. "Now go." Slowly, reluctantly, the men backed toward their horses, keeping wary eyes on Isaiah's silhouette. As they mounted and rode away, Harmon turned in his saddle for one final threat. "You can't watch your back forever, and that Indian woman, she'll get what's coming to her too." Isaiah remained on the ridge until the riders disappeared from sight, their dust trail fading into the morning light. Only then did he allow his shoulders to relax slightly, though his expression remained grave. The mention of Morning Star troubled him. Harmon's threat suggested this wasn't just about yesterday's confrontation. It had expanded to include the Comanche woman who had done nothing but attempt to trade peacefully. Isaiah guided his horse back down to his cabin, mentally calculating distances and time. Broken Rock Creek was 3 days' journey. Morning Star had at least a day's head start, if Harmon and his friends decided to pursue her. The decision formed in his mind with the clarity of absolute certainty. Isaiah Freeman had spent too many years of his life watching injustice unfold, learning when to stay silent for survival and when silence itself became complicity. This was not a time for silence. He quickly gathered supplies for the journey: ammunition, dried meat, coffee, and hardtack. Within an hour, he had secured his cabin as best he could and was riding west, following the faint trail Morning Star had taken the previous day. As he rode, the sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, casting his shadow ahead of him, a lone rider pursuing not vengeance or glory, but the simple, profound belief that dignity demanded defense, regardless of who threatened it or who needed protection. By midday of the second day, Isaiah knew he was being followed. The signs were subtle at first: disturbed gravel at a creek crossing, a startled covey of quail when there should have been no movement. By evening, he was certain. Riders were tracking him, staying just far enough back to avoid direct confrontation. Harmon and his friends, almost certainly. They must have returned to town after leaving his ranch, gathered supplies, perhaps recruited additional men, and set out in pursuit, both of him and, he suspected, of Morning Star. Isaiah pushed harder, reducing his rest stops and riding into the night. If he could reach the Comanche camp first, he could at least warn Morning Star and her people. A Comanche band, even a peaceful one living under treaty, would be better prepared to defend against troublemakers than a lone woman traveling with a sick child. The landscape changed as he rode west, the rolling prairie giving way to more broken country, scattered with mesas and dry arroyos. This was frontier in its truest sense, a borderland between worlds where boundaries blurred and old certainties crumbled. Near noon on the third day, he spotted dust on the horizon, a single rider moving at speed toward him. Isaiah reined in his horse, taking cover behind a rocky outcropping, rifle ready. The rider approached rapidly, and Isaiah felt a jolt of recognition. It was Morning Star, urging her pinto pony to a pace that spoke of desperate haste, alone. He stepped out from behind the rocks, waving to catch her attention. She spotted him and altered course, pulling her exhausted pony to a stop before him. "Freeman," she gasped, face streaked with dust and something darker, grief or fear, Isaiah couldn't tell. "They took her. They took my daughter." Isaiah's stomach tightened with dread. "Who?" "White men. 5, 6, I don't know. They followed me, waited until we camped." Her composure, so unshakable in town, had fractured. "I went to find water, came back. She was gone. Tracks lead back east." "Harmon," Isaiah said grimly, "and his friends." Morning Star nodded sharply. "They left this." She thrust a crumpled paper toward him. Isaiah smoothed it open, his jaw tightening as he read the crude message. "An eye for an eye, meet at Redemption Creek Crossing, come alone or the girl dies." "How old is your daughter?" Isaiah asked, already calculating what they were facing. 8 summers, Morning Star replied, her voice hollow. "She is sick, needs her medicine." Isaiah handed the note back, his decision already made. "I've seen men like Harmon before. They won't honor this. If you go alone, they'll likely kill you both." "I know," she said simply, "but I must go. She is my child." Isaiah nodded, understanding the immutable logic of a parent's love. "We'll go together." Morning Star studied him, surprise momentarily overcoming her distress. "Why would you risk more? This is not your fight." "Became my fight in that town square," Isaiah replied, "and no child deserves to be used this way, no matter whose child she is." Something shifted in Morning Star's expression, a recognition perhaps of the rare alignment of two people from different worlds, finding common cause in fundamental decency. "They will be waiting," she cautioned. "Many men against 2. Isaiah's mouth set in a grim line. "Then we'd best make sure they don't see both of us coming." Redemption Creek was little more than a trickle by late summer, cutting a shallow path through the rocky terrain 15 miles east of Broken Rock. The crossing consisted of a flat expanse of gravel where wagons and riders could easily ford the diminished stream. Isaiah arrived alone as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. He rode slowly, deliberately, making no attempt at stealth, one man approaching exactly as the note had demanded. From his vantage point, he could see them waiting, 6 men arranged in a loose semicircle on the far bank. Jack Harmon stood at the center, one hand resting on the shoulder of a small girl, whose stoic face betrayed her heritage despite her obvious illness. Even at this distance, Isaiah could see the flush of fever in her cheeks, the slight sway in her stance. Isaiah stopped at the creek's edge, making no move to cross. "Let the child go, Harmon," he called across the water. "She needs medical attention." Harmon laughed, the sound harsh in the still air. "Where's the squaw? Note said for her to come alone." "Change of plans," Isaiah replied evenly. "I'm here instead." "That ain't how this works, Freeman. We want the mother. An eye for an eye." "For what?" Isaiah challenged. "The woman did nothing to you." "Her kind killed my brother," Harmon snarled. "And you. You chose her over your own race." Isaiah shook his head slowly, still talking about kinds and races, still not understanding. "Understanding what?" Harmon demanded, his hand tightening on the girl's shoulder, making her wince. "That there's only one kind that matters," Isaiah said, his voice carrying clearly across the creek. "Decent and indecent, and kidnapping a sick child. That puts you firmly in the second category." The men shifted uncomfortably, several exchanging glances that suggested not all were comfortable with Harmon's plan. The youngest, the same one who had advocated retreat at Isaiah's ranch, looked particularly uneasy. "Last chance, Freeman," Harmon called. "Ride away now or you'll watch this little savage die before we deal with you." Isaiah remained still, making no move toward his weapon. "You won't harm that child, Harmon." "Oh, and why's that?" "Because you're already in the sights of a Comanche warrior who's watching your every move," Isaiah said calmly. "And because there's a line even men like you don't cross." Harmon's face contorted with rage and fear. His eyes darted to the surrounding ridges, searching for the unseen threat. The other men did the same, hands moving toward weapons, bodies tensing. It was all the distraction Isaiah needed. In one fluid motion, he drew his rifle and fired, not at the men, but at the ground directly in front of them, sending gravel spraying into their faces. Simultaneously, from a hidden position on the ridge to the south, Morning Star loosed an arrow that thudded into the ground between Harmon's feet. The combination, the rifle shot and the arrow appearing as if from nowhere, created instant chaos. Two men broke immediately, running for their horses. Another fell backward, scrambling away from the perceived threat. In the confusion, the young girl tore free from Harmon's now slack grip and ran toward the creek. Isaiah spurred his horse forward, splashing through the shallow water to meet her. With a practiced motion, he leaned down and swept her onto his saddle, just as Morning Star unleashed another arrow, this one grazing Harmon's arm. "You're dead, Freeman," Harmon screamed, clutching his bleeding arm. "Are you and the squaw both?" Isaiah turned his horse, shielding the child with his body as he rode back across the creek. Morning Star appeared from her hidden position, running to meet them with surprising speed. In one fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime on horseback, she swung up behind Isaiah, her arms encircling her daughter. "Isla," she murmured, the name like a prayer, as she pressed her cheek against her daughter's feverish face. "Ride," Isaiah urged, kicking his horse into a gallop as shots rang out behind them. Wild, inaccurate fire from panicked men whose courage faded with every yard of distance. They rode hard for an hour, following a route Isaiah had scouted earlier, a winding path through broken terrain that would be difficult to track. Only when he was certain they weren't being followed did he slow to a pace the overloaded horse could sustain. "There's a line shack used by cattle drivers about 5 miles ahead," he told Morning Star over his shoulder. "We can shelter there. Treat your daughter." Morning Star nodded, still cradling the girl who had lapsed into exhausted sleep despite the rough ride. "She needs her medicine, in my bag." They reached the abandoned line shack as darkness fell, a simple one-room structure with a sagging roof but solid walls. Isaiah helped Morning Star and her daughter inside, then tended to his horse, while the mother administered the herbal medicine mixed with the sugar she'd traded for in town. When he returned, Morning Star had made the girl comfortable on a rough blanket near the small fire she'd started. The child was sleeping peacefully, her breathing still labored, but her face more relaxed. "The medicine helps," Morning Star said, looking up as Isaiah entered. "By morning, fever will break." Isaiah nodded, setting down the small bundle of supplies he'd retrieved from his saddlebags. "Good. We'll rest here tonight. Decide our next steps in the morning." Morning Star studied him in the flickering firelight. "Why did you come?" she asked finally. Truth this time. Isaiah considered the question, giving it the weight it deserved. "Where I come from, we understand what it means to be seen as less than human, to have our children taken, our dignity denied." He paused. "Didn't matter to me that you're Comanche or that I'm black. What mattered was seeing another person treated as if they had no right to exist." Morning Star nodded slowly. "My people have word for this. Closest in your language might be soulkin. Not blood relation, but connected here." She touched her chest. "Some souls recognize each other across boundaries." Isaiah smiled faintly. "My mother would have liked that idea." They fell into comfortable silence, the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping child, the only sounds in the small cabin. "What will you do now?" Isaiah asked eventually. "Can't go back to your camp? Not right away. Harmon and his kind will be watching." "I know," Morning Star said simply. "We'll find new path." Isaiah hesitated, then offered the thought that had been forming in his mind. My ranch has good water, sheltered valley beyond the main pasture. Far enough from town to be safe. He met her eyes across the fire. You and your daughter would be welcome there, until she's fully recovered, until you decide what's next. Surprise flickered across Morningstar's face, followed by a thoughtful assessment. Your people would accept this? Comanche woman and child living on black man's land? Don't have people in the way you mean, Isaiah replied. Have my land, my horses, and my own mind about what's right. He paused. Town might talk. Let them. Morningstar studied him for a long moment before responding. You are strange, man, Isaiah Freeman, but good strange. She looked down at her sleeping daughter. We will come until Ayla is strong again. Then we decide. Isaiah nodded, satisfied. We'll leave at first light. Take the back trails. As dawn broke over the line shack, they prepared to depart. Ayla was already showing improvement, her fever reduced and her eyes brighter as she watched Isaiah saddle his horse. Are you the man who stood for my mother? She asked in halting English as he helped her mount. Isaiah smiled. I am. My mother says you have warrior heart but gentle hands, the girl said with the directness of childhood. She says it is rare combination. Isaiah glanced at Morningstar, who busied herself adjusting their few belongings, a hint of embarrassment in her normally composed face. Your mother is kind, he replied, and wise. They rode steadily through the morning, avoiding the main trails, Isaiah leading them through terrain few travelers would navigate voluntarily. By midday, they crested a ridge that overlooked his modest ranch, the small cabin, the corral, the spring-fed pond, and beyond it the sheltered valley he had mentioned. There, he said, pointing. Valley has good grazing. Stream doesn't dry up even in summer. Old Trapper built a cabin there years ago. Needs work, but walls are solid. Morningstar surveyed the land with a critical eye, assessing it not as a visitor, but as someone considering its potential for shelter and sustenance. Good land, she pronounced finally. You chose well. They made their way down to the main cabin, where Isaiah helped them dismount and carried the still weak Ayla inside. The interior was simple but well kept, a testament to a man who valued order and self-sufficiency. Rest here, he told them. I'll check the property boundaries, make sure we weren't followed. While he rode the perimeter of his land, Morningstar settled her daughter in Isaiah's bed and explored the cabin with curiosity. She was standing by his bookshelf, a small collection of well-worn volumes, when he returned. You read these? She asked, gesturing to the books. Isaiah nodded. When there's time. Winter evenings, mostly. She traced the spine of a leather-bound volume. My father believed learning enemies' ways was strength, not weakness. Sent me to mission school for 3 seasons. She turned to face him. Not all they taught was true, but reading opens many doors. That it does, Isaiah agreed, impressed anew by the complexity of the woman before him. The days that followed established a routine of cautious coexistence. Isaiah continued his ranch work, focusing on the areas closest to the cabin to maintain a protective presence. Morningstar tended to Ayla, whose health improved steadily, and gradually began contributing to the household, preparing meals, identifying edible plants on the property that Isaiah had overlooked, even repairing garments with a skill that put his rough stitching to shame. They spoke little but communicated much, developing the wordless understanding of people whose shared experience transcended their different backgrounds. A week passed without incident, then 2. By the 3rd week, Ayla was strong enough to follow Isaiah around the ranch, peppering him with questions about his horses, his life, and why the sky looked different over his land than it had over their camp, a question that made both adults smile. It was during the 4th week that Sheriff Delaney rode onto the property, alone and unannounced. Isaiah spotted him from the corral and moved to intercept, positioning himself between the approaching rider and the cabin where Morningstar and Ayla were preparing the midday meal. Sheriff, Isaiah greeted him neutrally, making no move to invite him further onto the property. Delaney reined in his horse, eyes taking in the cabin behind Isaiah, where Morningstar could be glimpsed through the window. Freeman, he acknowledged, Figured I'd find them here. Something I can help you with? Isaiah asked, his tone cordial but stance unwavering. Delaney sighed, removing his hat to wipe his brow in the midday heat. Got a situation in town. Harmon's been running his mouth about you harboring dangerous savages. Some folks are listening. And you listening too? I'm here, aren't I? Delaney countered. Wanted to see for myself before things get any more heated. Isaiah studied the older man. And now that you've seen. Delaney's gaze moved past him to the cabin again, where Ayla had appeared in the doorway, watching the exchange with wary curiosity. See a man making his own choices on his own property, Delaney said finally, and a child who doesn't look particularly dangerous to me. He resettled his hat, but Harmon's got friends in the county seat, been pushing for formal charges, kidnapping, interference with lawful retribution, all manner of nonsense. Retribution for what? Isaiah asked sharply. Woman was trading peacefully. Child was innocent of any wrongdoing. You and I might see it that way, Delaney conceded, but there's plenty who don't care about particulars when it comes to Indians, especially Comanche. Morning Star had emerged from the cabin now, standing protectively beside her daughter, her expression guarded but not fearful. What are you suggesting, Sheriff? Isaiah asked. Delaney hesitated, then spoke with reluctant honesty. I'm suggesting that while I have no intention of enforcing Harmon's brand of justice, I can't stop what might come next. He's gathering men, Freeman, making it about more than just his personal grudge, turning it into a cause. Defending women and children is my cause, Isaiah replied steadily. Always has been. Noble sentiment, Delaney acknowledged, but it might get you killed, and them too. He nodded toward Morning Star and Ayla. From the cabin doorway, Morning Star spoke, her voice clear. We will leave. Caused enough trouble for this man. No, Isaiah said immediately, turning to her. This is exactly what they want. To intimidate us into running, so they can tell themselves their way is right. Better running than dead, Morning Star countered pragmatically. Delaney watched this exchange with interest. Might be a third way, he said slowly. Fort Davis is looking for Comanche scouts for the cavalry. Peaceful bands under treaty can apply for protected status on the military reservation. They'd be safe there, Freeman, and you'd be free of this mess. Isaiah looked at Morning Star, their eyes meeting in silent communication, weighing options, calculating risks, considering futures neither had imagined 4 weeks earlier. Her decision, Isaiah said finally. Not mine to make. Morning Star stepped forward, standing beside Isaiah to address the sheriff directly. We will consider this. Need 2 days. Delaney nodded. I can give you that, but no more. Things are building in town. He gathered his reins. For what it's worth, Freeman, I think you did right. Just not sure this territory is ready for your kind of right. After the sheriff departed, Isaiah and Morning Star sat on the cabin's small porch, watching Ayla play with a kitten from the barn's recent litter. You should go with him, Isaiah said finally. Fort would be safer. Your people would be there. Ayla would have children her own age, her own culture. Morning Star was silent for a long moment. Perhaps, she agreed, but running feels like giving them victory. Not running, Isaiah corrected. Choosing your battlefield. Fighting doesn't always mean standing ground. Sometimes it means living well despite them, raising your daughter to remember her heritage with pride. And you? Morning Star asked. What will you choose? Isaiah looked out over his land, the modest ranch he'd built through years of hard work and determination. This is my place, he said simply. Won't be driven from it. Even if it means fighting alone? Wouldn't be the first time. Morning Star nodded, understanding. They sat in companionable silence as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber. 2 paths, she said finally. Both difficult, both necessary. She turned to face him directly, but perhaps not separate forever. Isaiah met her gaze, reading the unspoken possibility in her eyes. Not a promise, not yet, but an acknowledgement that their brief alliance had grown into something neither had anticipated. Perhaps not, he agreed. The next morning, Morning Star and Ayla prepared to depart for Fort Davis, where Delaney had promised to escort them safely. Isaiah helped them pack the few belongings they had accumulated during their stay. As they stood by the horses ready to leave, Ayla surprised him by wrapping her arms around his waist in a fierce hug. "We will come back," she announced, with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Mother promised." Isaiah looked questioningly at Morning Star, who smiled, the first full, unreserved smile he had seen from her. "I told her that brave people always find way back to each other," she explained, "that courage creates paths where none existed before." Isaiah nodded, emotion making speech difficult. Instead, he pressed something into her hand, a small brass key. "For the cabin in the valley," he said, "whenever you need it." Morning Star closed her fingers around the key, the simple object transforming into something far more significant, a promise, a possibility, a defiance of the boundaries others sought to enforce. "Until we meet again, Isaiah Freeman," she said formally. "Until then, Morning Star," he replied. As he watched them ride away, Isaiah knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't an ending but a beginning. Not just for them, but perhaps for something larger. A small act of defiance in a town called Redemption Creek had created a ripple that would continue long after today. Some battles were fought with guns and arrows. Others were fought simply by existing, by forming connections across manufactured divides, by recognizing dignity where others refused to see it. And in those battles, Isaiah reflected, watching until the riders disappeared from view, victory wasn't measured in territory claimed or enemies defeated, but in the quiet triumph of humanity over hatred, of connection over division. The most revolutionary act sometimes was simply to see another person's full humanity and to stand for it, whatever the cost. You've just witnessed how a single act of courage can change lives and challenge the deepest prejudices of a time. This is what the Black Rancher channel is all about, uncovering these buried moments when ordinary people showed extraordinary moral courage. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that throughout history, there have always been those who stood against injustice, even when it was dangerous to do so. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful, forgotten stories to light. Stories that remind us that courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about doing what's right despite your fear. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the untold history of the American West. Until next time, remember that the most powerful legacy we can leave is simply standing up for the dignity of others.